The wind came off the river like a blade that night, cutting through the narrow streets of the city with a cruelty that only December could summon, and Clara Bennett felt every inch of it through the thin fabric of her coat. A coat that had once been warm, but was now little more than a memory of warmth stitched together with fraying threads and old promises. Her shoes were the worst of it. The left one had split along the sole 3 weeks ago, and no amount of tape or cardboard could keep the icy slush from seeping through, so that with every step she took down the long stretch of Warrington Avenue, she felt the cold bite into her skin like tiny teeth, gnawing, patient, relentless. She pulled her son closer against her hip, though he was too big now to be carried properly, his legs dangling and his small arms wrapped tight around her neck, his breath coming out in short white clouds that dissolved almost as quickly as they appeared. "Almost there, baby," she whispered, though she did not know exactly where there was, only that somewhere ahead there might be a shelter with an open bed, or a church with an unlocked door, or some small mercy she had not yet been shown. The city moved around her the way it always did, indifferent and glittering, taxis splashing through puddles of grey slush, their headlights cutting gold streaks across the wet pavement, and above her the towers of glass and steel rose into the night sky, like monuments to a world that had long since stopped noticing people like her. She had not always been invisible. 2 years ago she had worked the front desk of a marketing firm 3 blocks from where she now walked, had worn blazers instead of borrowed coats, had complained about parking tickets instead of praying for warm floors, and had never once imagined that a single diagnosis, her son's diagnosis, could unravel a life so completely, so quietly, until there was nothing left to hold on to. The medical bills had come first, then the missed shifts, then the job itself, slipping away from her like sand through fingers that could no longer close tight enough to keep it, and after that came the eviction notice taped to a door that was no longer hers, and after that came the shelters, some kind, some cruel, all crowded, and after that came the street. She stopped for a moment beneath the awning of a shuttered bakery, setting her son down gently, crouching so that her eyes were level with his, brushing a strand of dark hair from his forehead with fingers that shook, not entirely from the cold. "Are we going to sleep outside again?" he asked her, his voice small, and she felt something crack open in her chest, wide and aching, because there was no way to answer that question that would not break her. "We'll find somewhere warm," she said instead, and she hoped, desperately, that it was not a lie. Across the street and half a block down, the Ashworth Tower rose 52 stories into the darkness, its windows lit in scattered constellations, and outside its grand glass entrance a small crowd had begun to gather, drawn by something that had been spreading through the city all day like wildfire, a story too strange and too tender to ignore. The story was this, that Richard Sinclair, the billionaire founder of Ashworth Global, a man whose name appeared on magazine covers and hospital wings and university buildings, had called a press conference for that very night, and had announced, through a statement that left reporters stunned, that he was offering $750,000 to anyone who could identify a woman in a photograph, so old and so worn that its edges had gone soft as cloth. He would not say who she was. He would only say that 22 years ago, on a night much like this one, cold and merciless and dark, she had saved his life, and that he had spent every year since trying to find her again, and had failed, and that now, with time pressing against him in ways the public did not yet understand, he could not bear to fail any longer. Inside the tower, in an office on the 40th floor, Richard Sinclair stood at the window with the photograph pressed between 2 fingers, his reflection ghosted faintly against the glass, superimposed over the glittering city below, and he studied the woman's face the way he had studied it 10,000 times before, memorizing the curve of her tired smile, the kindness etched into eyes that had seen too much hardship of their own. He had been 19 years old and utterly lost when she found him, standing at the edge of the Callahan Bridge with the black water churning far below, the whole world reduced to a single unbearable moment, and he still remembered the sound of her footsteps approaching through the snow, unhurried, unafraid, and the sound of her voice, low and steady, saying words he had never forgotten, though he had long since forgotten the sound of her name, if she had ever given it at all. She had stayed with him until the sun came up. She had given him her scarf, her last few dollars, and something far more valuable than either, the simple, unwavering insistence that his life still mattered, that the story was not over, that somewhere ahead there was a version of him worth becoming. And then, as the city stirred awake around them, she had walked away into the grey morning light and never once looked back. He never saw her again. For 22 years he had built an empire on the foundation of that single night, had told himself that every success, every dollar, every building bearing his name was somehow a tribute to a stranger's kindness, and yet none of it had ever felt like enough, because the debt he owed her could not be repaid with buildings or headlines, only with her forgiveness, her recognition, the simple relief of telling her, finally, that her kindness had not been wasted. Now the doctors had given him a timeline he did not want to think about, a diagnosis buried beneath careful language and gentle warnings, and suddenly the search that had once felt like a quiet private ache had become something urgent, something desperate, something that gnawed at him in the small hours of the night when the tower had emptied and only the hum of distant traffic remained. Down in the lobby, an old janitor named Walter Higgins pushed his cart slowly across the marble floor, his back bent slightly from decades of labor, his hands rough and scarred, his eyes carrying a quiet weight that few of the tower's employees ever paused to notice, because to them he was simply part of the building's machinery, present but unseen, useful but unremarkable. Walter had worked in that lobby for 11 years, had mopped its floors through summer heat and winter storms, had nodded politely to executives who never learned his name, and had, in all that time, told almost no one anything about the life he had lived before the mop and the cart and the grey uniform that hung a little too loosely on his thinning frame. He had seen the flyers posted near the elevator banks that afternoon, the photograph reproduced in grainy black and white, and he had stood there for a long moment, his cart forgotten beside him, his breath caught somewhere high in his chest, because he knew that face. He had known it for a very long time. Outside, the crowd outside the tower grew thicker as the night deepened, reporters and curious onlookers and the simply desperate, all drawn by the promise of $750,000 and the strange, aching hope that a single act of kindness, decades old, might somehow still be repaid. Clara Bennett, walking past the edges of that crowd with her son's small hand wrapped tightly in hers, had no way of knowing that the answer to Richard Sinclair's search was closer than he could possibly imagine, folded quietly into the memory of an old janitor who had not yet decided whether to speak, and into a photograph that, if she had only glimpsed it clearly beneath the streetlights, she might have recognized as well. She kept walking, her broken shoe filling slowly with icy water, her son's small hand tightening around her fingers, and somewhere behind her, in the golden light spilling from the tower's grand entrance, a story was about to begin unraveling that would change both of their lives forever. The cold had reached a place inside Clara that no coat could touch now, a cold that lived beneath her ribs and pressed against her lungs with every breath, and still she walked, because walking was the only thing left that felt like choice. The only motion that separated her from simply lying down in the snow and letting the city decide what happened next. Her son had stopped asking questions. That frightened her more than anything else, more than the empty pockets or the split shoe or the shelter 3 blocks back that had turned them away because the beds were full, because there were always more people than beds, always more need than mercy, and she had learned by now not to expect the arithmetic to ever work out in her favor. She could see the lights of Ashworth Tower ahead, spilling gold across the wet pavement, and she could see the crowd gathered near its entrance, dozens of people bundled in coats far warmer than her own, their breath rising in pale clouds beneath the glow of camera lights, and for a moment she almost turned away, because crowds meant attention, and attention was something she had learned to avoid, the cur, way a wounded animal avoids open ground. But her son was shivering. She could feel it through the thin fabric between them, small tremors that had nothing to do with fear, and something in her chest hardened with the kind of resolve that only a mother's desperation can forge, and she found herself moving toward the light instead of away from it, thinking only that a crowd meant warmth, that warmth meant survival, that survival was the only thing that mattered now. Inside the lobby of Ashworth Tower, Walter Higgins stood frozen beside his cart, the mop handle still gripped loosely in one hand, his eyes fixed on the flyer taped to the marble pillar near the elevator bank, the grainy photograph staring back at him with an expression he had not seen in over 20 years, and yet would have recognized anywhere, in any light, in any lifetime. Eleanor. The name rose in him like something long, buried, finally breaking the surface of still water, and with it came a flood of memory so sudden and so overwhelming that he had to steady himself against the cart, his knuckles whitening around the handle, his old heart pounding beneath a chest that had carried this secret quietly for far too long. He remembered a winter almost as bitter as this one, a shelter kitchen on the east side of the city, steam rising from pots of soup too thin to be called a meal, and a young woman with tired eyes and a gentle voice who had noticed him sitting alone in the corner, a man freshly discharged from a job he had lost, and a marriage he had lost, and a will to continue that he had very nearly lost as well. She had sat down across from him without asking permission, had pushed her own bowl of soup toward him when his had run empty, and had talked to him for 2 hours about nothing important at all, simply so that he would not have to sit alone with the silence that had been threatening to swallow him whole. He had never forgotten her kindness. He had never forgotten her name either. Eleanor Bennett, spoken so casually that night as she introduced herself, never imagining that a stranger's gratitude would carry her memory forward across 2 decades into a lobby she had never once set foot in, staring back at him now from a photograph offering $750,000 to anyone who could say her name aloud. He did not think about the money. He thought instead about the years since, the quiet ache of never having found her again to thank her properly, the way her small act of kindness had steadied him enough to rebuild a life he had once thought unsalvageable, and the way that steadiness had eventually led him here, to this lobby, to this cart, to this uniform that fit him imperfectly but had given him purpose all the same. He set the mop down slowly. His hands were trembling, though not from the cold, and he found himself walking toward the reception desk with a determination he had not felt in years, his old knees aching with every step, his heart hammering against ribs that suddenly felt too small to contain it. "I need to speak with someone," he said to the young receptionist, his voice rough with disuse, "about the woman in the photograph." She looked at him with the polite dismissiveness the tower's staff so often reserved for him, already halfway through a practiced apology about protocol and appointments when the elevator behind her chimed softly, and Richard Sinclair stepped out into the lobby, his tie loosened, his eyes hollowed by exhaustion and the particular grief of a search that refused to end. He had come downstairs simply to breathe, to escape the crowded silence of his office for a few minutes before the next round of calls began, and he might have walked straight past the reception desk entirely, had Walter not lifted his voice, hoarse but certain, cutting through the lobby's quiet hum like a single struck bell. "Eleanor," Walter said. The word landed in the room and seemed to stop everything around it, the receptionist's typing, the hum of the heating vents, the distant murmur of the crowd beyond the glass doors, all of it falling away beneath the weight of that single syllable, spoken with a certainty that could not be mistaken for guesswork. Richard turned slowly, his exhaustion forgotten, his eyes fixing on the old man standing beside the cart, with a mixture of disbelief and something close to desperate hope. And for a long moment neither of them spoke, the distance between them charged with 22 years of longing finally, impossibly, closing. "You knew her," Richard said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I knew her kindness," Walter answered, and in his eyes Richard saw the same quiet gratitude he had carried himself for over 2 decades, the recognition of one debt meeting another, 2 strangers bound together by the same woman's generosity, offered freely on 2 different winters to 2 different broken men. Walter told him everything he remembered, the shelter kitchen, the thin soup, the 2 hours of gentle conversation that had saved a man from despair he had never spoken of to anyone. And Richard listened with his hands pressed flat against the reception desk, steadying himself against a grief and a hope so tangled together he could no longer separate them. But there was more. Walter's voice grew quieter, heavier, as he explained that he had lost touch with Eleanor not long after that winter, had heard, years later, through a mutual acquaintance from the shelter, that she had passed away, her heart giving out far too young, leaving behind a daughter she had raised largely on her own, a daughter Walter had never met but had often wondered about, hoping the world had been kinder to her than it often was to children who inherited nothing but their mother's love and very little else. Richard's face went pale. A daughter, he repeated, and something in his chest twisted painfully, because if Eleanor was gone, then his search, the search that had defined the last stretch of his life, could never end the way he had imagined, with her forgiveness spoken aloud, with the simple relief of thanking her properly. But perhaps it could end differently. Perhaps the debt he owed could still be honored, not through the woman herself, but through whatever she had left behind, and as that thought took shape in his mind, urgent and clarifying, he felt something shift inside him, the grief reorganizing itself into purpose. "Do you know her name?" Richard asked. "The daughter's." Walter shook his head slowly, apologetically, but then his eyes drifted toward the glass doors of the lobby, toward the crowd gathered outside beneath the golden light, and among the strangers and reporters and curious onlookers, his gaze caught for a moment on a young woman standing near the edge of the crowd, thin coat wrapped tightly around her, a small boy pressed against her side, her eyes scanning. The tower's entrance with an exhaustion that looked, to Walter's old and careful eyes, disturbingly familiar. He could not have said what it was exactly, some quality in the way she held herself, some echo in the shape of her face beneath the streetlight, but something made him step toward the glass, his breath catching, his pulse quickening, with a possibility too fragile yet to name aloud. Richard followed his gaze, and for a long, suspended moment, the two men stood side by side at the window, watching a stranger they did not yet know they were looking for. Standing just beyond the glass, cold and tired, and utterly unaware that the answer to a 22-year search, and the beginning of an unimaginable new chapter, was about to walk through the very doors she had almost avoided entirely. The doors of Ashworth Tower swung open before Clara had even decided to walk through them, pushed by a gust of wind that seemed almost impatient, almost deliberate, as though the night itself had grown tired of watching her hesitate at the threshold of warmth she had not yet given herself permission to want. Her son stumbled slightly against her side, and the sudden rush of heated air from the lobby hit them both like something almost holy, a warmth so complete and so unfamiliar that Clara felt her knees weaken beneath her, felt tears spring unbidden to eyes that had long since forgotten how to cry from anything other than exhaustion. She had only meant to stand near the entrance for a moment, to borrow a little warmth before the security guards inevitably asked her to move along, the way they always did, the way the world always did, but she had not accounted for the two men standing just inside the glass, watching her with an intensity that made her stomach tighten with old, familiar fear. "Ma'am," the older man said, stepping forward, his uniform worn, but his eyes gentle in a way that disarmed her more than she expected. "Please, come inside. You're safe here." Clara hesitated, her hand tightening around her son's shoulder, every instinct honed by 2 years of hardship, telling her that safety was not a word strangers offered freely, that kindness from men in tall towers usually came with conditions attached, small print folded invisibly into every offer. But the boy beside her, the younger of the two men, though not young at all really, simply weathered in a different way than the old janitor, was looking at her now with an expression she could not quite place, something between disbelief and desperate hope, his eyes moving searchingly across her face, as though trying to locate something familiar in features he had never before seen. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice barely steady. "Clara," she said carefully, "Clara Bennett." The name landed in the lobby like a struck bell, and she watched, bewildered, as both men seemed to sway slightly on their feet, as though the 2 syllables of her surname had physically moved something inside them, had confirmed some impossible hope neither had dared speak aloud. "Bennett," Richard repeated, his voice cracking around the word. "Your mother, was her name Eleanor?" Clara's breath caught somewhere high in her throat, and for a moment the lobby tilted strangely around her, the marble floor and golden light, and gathered crowd beyond the glass all blurring together beneath the sudden, overwhelming force of hearing her mother's name spoken by a stranger in a place so far removed from anything her mother had ever known. "How do you know that?" she whispered. Richard did not answer with words at first. Instead, he reached into his jacket with trembling hands and withdrew the photograph, worn soft at its edges from 22 years of careful handling, and held it out to her. And Clara looked down at her mother's face, younger than she had ever known her, smiling gently beneath a street lamp on a night that had apparently changed a stranger's life so completely that he had spent 2 decades and a fortune trying to find her again. "She saved my life," Richard said, his voice raw now, stripped of all the polish and composure that had carried him through boardrooms and headlines for 20 years. 22 years ago, on the worst night of my life, your mother sat with me until sunrise and gave me every reason to keep living, and I never got the chance to thank her properly. I never even learned her name. Clara's hands were shaking as she held the photograph, tears falling freely now down cheeks reddened by cold and disbelief, because she had grown up hearing fragments of her mother's quiet generosity, small stories about strangers helped and burdens shared, but never this, never the full weight of what her mother's kindness had built in the life of a man who now stood before her as one of the wealthiest people in the country. "She passed away 4 years ago," Clara said softly, the words still difficult to speak aloud even now. Her heart, it just gave out. She worked so hard for so long, taking care of everyone but herself. Richard's face crumpled with a grief so sudden and complete that Walter stepped forward instinctively, placing a steadying hand on the younger man's shoulder. And for a long moment none of them spoke, the lobby filled only with the quiet sound of shared sorrow, 3 strangers bound together by the same woman's memory, mourning a loss that belonged, in some strange and beautiful way, to all of them, equally. "I'm sorry," Clara whispered, though she was not entirely certain what she was apologizing for, perhaps simply for the unbearable unfairness of it all, that her mother's kindness had traveled so far and lasted so long, only to never receive the thanks it had so richly deserved. "Don't be sorry," Richard said, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand, a gesture so unpracticed it seemed to surprise even him. "She gave me everything. She gave me my life. And I intend to spend whatever time I have left making sure that gift was never wasted." It was then that he noticed, truly noticed, the state of her, the broken shoe soaked through with melted snow, the coat too thin for the bitter cold outside, the small boy pressed against her side with cheeks flushed red from exposure, and something in Richard's expression shifted from grief into fierce, immediate resolve. "How long have you been out there?" he asked, gesturing toward the doors, toward the city beyond them, cold and indifferent and unforgiving. Clara's silence answered for her. "Not one more night," Richard said, his voice suddenly firm, carrying the same quiet authority that had built an empire from nothing. "Not one more night. Do you understand me? Whatever you need, tonight, tomorrow, for the rest of your life if necessary, it is yours. It is the very least I owe your mother's memory." Clara opened her mouth to protest, some old instinct rising in her, the reflexive pride of a woman who had learned to distrust generosity that arrived too easily, but Richard shook his head gently, cutting off the refusal before it could fully form. "This isn't charity," he said. "This is a debt 22 years overdue. Please, let me finally pay it." That night, for the first time in longer than she could remember, Clara Bennett slept in a warm bed, her son curled safely beside her in a hotel suite arranged within the hour, his small chest rising and falling in the peaceful rhythm of a child who finally, blessedly, did not have to wonder where morning would find them. Clara herself did not sleep for a long time. She lay awake instead, staring at the ceiling, turning her mother's photograph over and over in her hands, trying to reconcile the woman she had known, tired and quietly loving, with the woman capable of changing a stranger's entire trajectory with nothing more than 2 hours of gentle conversation and a shared bowl of soup. But perhaps, she thought, that was exactly the point, that her mother had never set out to change anyone's life, had never calculated the eventual return on her kindness, had simply seen another human being in pain and had chosen, in that single ordinary moment, to sit beside him instead of walking past. In the weeks that followed, Richard Sinclair kept his promise fully. He established a fund in Eleanor Bennett's name, not simply for Clara and her son, though their needs were met completely and permanently, but for families across the city caught in the same brutal arithmetic that had once claimed Clara's stability. Families one crisis away from the street, families who needed not just charity, but the same quiet, dignified belief that their story was not yet over. Walter Higgins, too, found his life transformed, not by wealth, though Richard insisted on that as well, but by the simple public acknowledgement of a kindness he had carried privately for over 20 years, a recognition that seemed to straighten his back and steady his hands in ways that no amount of money ever could. Clara returned to school that following spring, her tuition and expenses covered entirely, working slowly toward the career in social work she had once dreamed of before life had rerouted her so completely, driven now by an understanding of hardship that no classroom could have taught her, and a determination to extend her mother's kindness outward into the lives of strangers she had not yet met. Her son grew steadier with each passing season, the shadows beneath his eyes fading, his small hand no longer gripping hers with the desperate tightness of a child uncertain where the next meal or the next warm night might come from. And Richard Sinclair, for his part, found something he had not expected to find at the end of his long search, not merely closure, though that came too, but a family of sorts, an ongoing connection to the woman who had saved him, carried forward through her daughter and grandson in ways that felt less like debt repaid and more like grace extended. On quiet evenings, when the tower's lights burned low and the city outside settled into its gentler rhythms, Richard would sometimes think back to that bitter night on Callahan Bridge and to the stranger who had chosen, against all reason, to sit down beside him in the dark and remind him that his life still mattered. He understood now what he had perhaps always known, that kindness rarely announces its own importance in the moment it is given. That Eleanor Bennett could never have known, on that cold winter night so many years ago, that her simple willingness to stay would ripple outward across decades, saving not only the man she found, but eventually, through him, the daughter and grandson she had left behind.